It's important for us at the Games Institute to recognize the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge, laws, and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share the land that we live and work on today. We are working to continually make space for Indigenous scholars, designers, commentators, and creators, and to uplift all voices that are marginalized both in the academic space and also in the gaming space. We acknowledge that the land that we work and live on today is the traditional land of the Attawaddaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people, and the University of Waterloo, where we work, is situated on the Haldimand Tract, which includes 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River. Our ability to be living and working here now in the Waterloo region, in Ontario, at the University of Waterloo, is a direct benefit of the policies of expulsion and assimilation of Indigenous people during the time of settlement and confederation and since then. We have a responsibility as such beneficiaries to acknowledge and understand both the history and the current experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and for this understanding to inform the work that we do so that we stop perpetuating the damages of colonization and begin to repair them. Land acknowledgements such as this are just one very, very small step in doing that work. If you want to learn more about the Games Institute and our commitment to anti-racism, decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion, please check out the GI website and we can link to it in the chat. So welcome to the Cap and Trade Game Project Postmortem with Alex Fleck and Dr. Jason Grove. I'm Dr. Emma Vossen, the Research Communications Officer here at the Games Institute, and I'd like to take a moment to talk about the Institute and give some context about the land from which we work. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Games Institute, or the GI, is a research institute at the University of Waterloo that is home to interdisciplinary researchers who seek to advance, study, design interactive and immersive technologies and experiences. Our research, of course, includes games like the one we are going to talk about today, but it also includes interactive and immersive technologies at large. So we endeavor to be a place where researchers from all backgrounds can come and work and learn together from each other beyond the boundaries of discipline. So getting back to today, the Canadian Cap and Trade Simulation is a serious game which is designed to teach undergraduate chemical engineering and environmental studies students about carbon tax and trade systems in Canada, and it was created by PhD candidate Alex Fleck and Dr. Jason Grove. Alex Fleck is a PhD candidate in English language and literature who studies retro gaming, hardware, software, and modding and fan communities to understand changes over time to consumer culture, material literacy, and legacy platforms. He also helps design games such as this one with other researchers in ongoing GI projects and partnerships. Dr. Jason Grove is the Associate Chair, Undergraduate Studies and Graduate Attributes Lecturer in Chemical Engineering. Professor Grove obtained his PhD from the University of Waterloo, investigating the microbial community ecology in biofilters used for air pollution control. I hope I got that right. Yep. Professor Grove is also a senior associate with the Delphi Group, where he previously worked full-time and has expertise in strategic sustainability consulting, in particular related to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. Today, the two of them will talk about the Canadian Cap and Trade Simulation and how it works, as well as their experience in the process of game design and interdisciplinary collaboration fostered by the Games Institute. So last thing, we ask those joining us online to stay muted and those here to keep your laptops and cell phones silent. That's all. Thank you so much. I'll let you take over.
Thank you. All right. Okay. Thank you for the introduction and welcome everyone.
We already sort of did this part in some ways, which is really appreciated, Emma. I don't know if I have much to add to mine, honestly.
No, we were going to talk about ourselves, but
yeah.
we had a great introduction, so I think we'll move on. We're going to be quite informal in this discussion.
It's a bit of a itinerary for today. So we've got who we are. We'll do the project origins. A little bit about research creation and what it is, collaborating in GI project management, And then straight into what the game is, pedagogical goals, design goals, an overview of how it works, the sort of process we went through in prototyping and testing it, and then sort of our output, what we ended up with and how we think of it as sustainable or how it could be sustainable. Last, sort of like challenges, benefits, and future consideration in the collaborative process. Okay. Oh, sorry, I missed one. The VLS grant is how we got the money to do. So the first thing to talk about is Emma's already given an introduction as to what the Games Institute is in general, but sort of integrating it into what we've done, how it worked for us is basically we wouldn't have met without the Games Institute to sort of have the collaborative space and to make these sort of connections happen. The team worked through sort of Games Institute administration and support. There was game testing that they did, thankfully, because that was very useful. There's prototyping materials here just as an environment to do game design. I think it's super valuable that it's here and that the sort of way we've done these kinds of partnerships has evolved over time as well. I've done a bunch of these and I think this was the smoothest version, which is amazing. And I hope it keeps going. Yeah. Okay, I want to talk a little bit, this is more, it's probably the only thing I'm saying as an English grad student that might be specifically and only interesting to humanities grad students. It's like, how do you become a person who does research creation? And I'm going to define it here at a place like the Games Institute doing a humanities degree. So there's a SHRC sort of category called research creation that's been sort of dealt with before. It's almost like an artist practitioner. I don't know if that's what a game designer is, but that seems to be what we've been doing. So I, as part of this project, it wasn't part of the initial plan that I was going to write a bunch of papers at the end or anything like this. My sort of role was to design the game and sort of embed research in that project. So the definition, this is by Natalie Lovelace, is the use of artistic forms and methods as the rendering public, or so the publishing part of research within a university context. So there's politics there, and I think it's a great book that Lovelace has written. If anyone's interested, if you want to talk to me more about it after, but basically this is how I'm coming at my place in a project like this and projects that I've done before like it. Okay. Yeah, so originally comes out of art and art criticism. So it's thinking about how an artist can be a person who embeds academic ideas and ideals in their work. There's a bunch of sort of synonymous terms that have happened that are geographically located elsewhere. Research creation is here in Canada. That's a specifically Canadian thing, but there's practice-based research, practice-led research, everything you see here. Again, this is sort of an overview. If you're interested, I can follow up with more. So my question to myself as I've been doing this and thinking about how to write and publish about the experience is, is game designing an artist researcher sort of vocation, and how does that work? And what does that look like? And what are the politics of publishing out of it? So where do we sort of be productive as academics in the system out of this? I've been thinking about that. Okay. And this is for Jason, I believe. I can move it along if you want.
Sure. So we're, I just want to go over a little bit about what carbon trading is, because that's kind of the purpose of the game is to simulate it. So you need some idea of what a carbon market is. So so cap and trade or carbon trading, the idea is to reduce the emissions in some jurisdiction. So in order to do that, the government, the regulator role, creates allowances in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So how many emissions are allowed, and then there's some method of allocating those to the people that emit them. So factories, electricity generating plants, and so on. And actually, there's a whole bunch of choices when you make that decision about how you do the allocation and who you do the allocation to. It's it's sort of an interesting problem in kind of good governance and good regulation. So those emitters, which companies, most regs are at the facility level. So some factory has a stack in it that emits gases. They need to retire allowances which are equivalent to the emissions that they generate. So from the company's perspective, what they want to do is to do that at minimal cost. And then from the government's perspective, if they design the system well, that will make the emissions in that jurisdiction go down. The government has another thing it cares about, though, is it doesn't want to destroy the economy. Like, you could make the emissions go to zero just by closing everything, but that has bad sort of side effects. So the regulator emitter, that's like the company, they have to decide what to do. So they can make their emissions go down, and that typically costs money. They have to do something different. They could reduce their production. That will make their emissions go down, but obviously it will also hurt their bottom line. That's one of the kind of negative side effects you can have. They could like game the system, which may have other consequences for them, but they could, if your jurisdiction has boundaries where you can easily move the production of whatever widget you make across that boundary and then ship it back in, you could dodge the regulation. Now, obviously, the government really wants to avoid that, and there'll be consequences probably if the company or the sector does that. It won't be viewed very well. Or lastly, and this is the market bit, this is the trading idea, maybe there are other emitters that can reduce their emissions more cheaply. So that this is kind of meant to be the benefit of the market system. So if another regulated emitter can overachieve its emission reductions, it can then take the allowance it got and turn them into performance credits and sell them in the market. And that might be a more efficient way for the first emitter to, rather than actually reducing its emissions, it might just buy those credits. Alternatively, there'll be some threshold where you don't bother regulating emitters below some number. Now, those companies might also have emission reduction projects they could do. So they can do those and register them. These are what offset credits are. So they achieve the reductions and the regulator comes up with some way of certifying them. And then they can trade just like the performance credits inside the market. So the idea is it's a market mechanism, and it doesn't matter where the emissions occur. So the idea is to try and find the lowest cost emission reductions. And then over time, you can keep driving it lower. So why did we want to do this as a serious game, or what's my motivation? Well, that was kind of a nutshell of it. There's a whole bunch of sort of nuances, and it's really non-intuitive. Like the idea of an offset, it's like a commodity, but it's a commodity of a thing that you didn't emit. It's like you're measuring something that didn't happen. That's not a very intuitive thing. I'm a chemical engineer. We normally measure stuff that you can look at and like weigh and things, not things that didn't happen. And then from the government's, the whole system perspective, it's quite complex, and there's a whole bunch of issues around. If you design it wrong, you actually won't get the effects you desire. So the idea of this is to give the students some insight into this. They can try out being in those different roles in a kind of simulated environment, simplified, obviously, and understand that. So our goal is that by students doing this, they'll achieve some learning outcomes. One is they'll actually be able to understand and explain how cap and trade works, which in a way which is, they hopefully achieve sort of more fully than they would do if we just write a big long description and they read it. One is that they'll be able to use that kind of understanding and insight to look at how different cap and trade systems have been set up, because there's different choices that regulators in different jurisdictions make, and that has consequences in terms of how the scheme functions. And then finally, they should have an understanding of the role of those different people, the emitter and the regulator, and what strategies they might want to adopt and why. More of kind of a business and strategy understanding.
Okay, so one of the things we start off with in the design process is thinking about genres of games that might fit the sort of learning outcomes. So how is it we communicate the complexity of the system through play? And the two genres that ended up informing our design the most, I find, was a sort of asynchronous version of chess by mail. So it's been done for a long, long time. It's done by email now. You can do it instantly, even if you want to. That's a thing. And then also Sid Meier's Civilization. I picked 6, but any of them would do, I think. And I think the sort of parallels between this and the design we ended up with are that you have the potential for making a lot of complex decisions in a certain turn or amount of time. And then basically the board updates itself. And so you're going to see how the sort of design is related to that. Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot to go through here. So starting with an overview of the game, if you can imagine a class of students, say 30 students, they're split into 4 or 5 teams. 3/4 of them are going to be regulated emitters, which is this sort of roll card here. I can describe in more detail in a second. And the other quarter are going to be regulators. So they're setting up the market and setting the caps for each of the other teams, and basically making it, just defining the market sort of conditions that everyone has to participate in. As Jason said, you can set that up poorly, deliberately, if you'd like to, and there are a lot of ways you can play with those levers to sort of make an interesting lesson for the students. If you have a short lesson in mind or a longer one, We designed it to be pretty flexible that way. Yeah, so 2 to 5 students. We determined that less people than that on one team was a little daunting, just because there's a lot of math and there's a lot of things you have to calculate on your own. Yeah. So there are 4 different facility rules, and the way we derived these was basically out of looking at data about who emits and which industries emit the most. And so the data that the Canadian government provides isn't so specific as to say which specific facilities, but it does give you industry sort of things. So we sort of genericize that to come up with ammonia, oil sands, cement production, and power production. So each of these rules has their own deck of cards. They have their own sort of sets of levers they can mess with and things they can do in a given turn.
So from the engineering side, those are interesting because they have quite different emission reduction opportunities as well. They have different challenges that they have to take on, because there's a technical audience. I think the game's actually very accessible to non-technical people, but there's a technical audience part of it as well.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that's interesting too is you can build into sort of the mechanisms we've designed the geographic specificity that we're interested in the first place. So you can have a Canadian context where specifically you couldn't do certain cards, or it's very difficult to execute on them because the rock from that area is just hard to drill into, and you can't store carbon in it, or something like that. Okay. So, okay, I want to break down the card. I forgot about that. So I'm going to go over sort of all the mechanisms and little things that can happen in the game, things we can change using Excel in a minute. It's so exciting. I know Excel's the best. But I think this is a better visual interpretation, just because students would have this in front of them. So they'd be on the ammonia producer team, and they'd have this in front of them as a sort of way to remind themselves of their starting budget, and a bunch of other sort of things we have in place here. Stakeholder confidence I can talk about in a while. This presentation is interesting because it's hard to teach a person how to play a game in a presentation, and we're not going to try for that, but somewhere in between, like informative enough that you could ask questions but not play the game. But yeah, there's cooperation between, passively anyway, between the different emitter roles. So there's a few things going on here we can talk about after. Okay. And this is one of the action cards. So basically what happens in terms of play is there's an action phase and a discovery phase. In the action phase, that's when the emitter teams play. So they pick enough sort of cards based on action points. They have 7 per round. And you can see the cost at the bottom here of the card. The forestation card on the right is 2. So you can play a few of those in one turn. And there's a lot of other things to take into account. We have the scientific description there, logistical description. So what happens, like how it actually works to execute it. What happens if you want to play this later? So is there a benefit to playing it once and then revisiting the same strategy again, and how that works? Risk is something I'll talk about in a minute, but basically it's a thing that a team has to think about pretty carefully as they're considering what their move would be. It's all represented on cards. There's I think 25 total, including some that every sort of emitter role can do, and then some that are unique to each.
And some of them have dependencies where you have to do a card first, which is sort of enabling, because it represents like investing in technology or something to be. And there's often delays in them because these are big industrial facilities. You can't just, in real life, you can't just slap something in the same month you decide to. It might take you 2 years to do the project.
So there's a time cost associated for sure, and a lag there. Maybe for instance would help. So like this offset afforestation is about planting forests, and it's as Jason described before, it's kind of like you're saying that by putting carbon somewhere else, you're reducing your carbon. If that makes sense. So you're planting trees so that at some point in the future, you have less carbon emissions, except it's counted right away, which is an interesting sort of mechanic we built in. And the government insures forest afforestation, which we can sort of have as a mechanism to turn that against the player. So if they take the risk, which is it's kind of risky, then there's actually a roll every turn, see if your forest catches on fire, and that sort of thing. So there are safer investments, but also ones that reduce less carbon at once. That's some of the balance we're going for.
Yeah, and it's one of the interesting nuances for real regulators, because that's a real project to grow a forest that removes carbon from the atmosphere, and it's a real reversal when it burns down. And the company doesn't necessarily want to take the risk, so the regulator has to kind of design in a mechanism to spread it. They end up normally doing some kind of group insurance, and it's the effect of that mitigation.
which means in the game, if a forest does burn down, then it raises the cost for everyone to then use the same card, even though it's not to do with them specifically. So there are ways, like it's not that they played the original afforestation card, everybody sort of takes the hit though. Okay, so risk is the bottom right sort of value there, and every card has one. And there's basically a d20 roll, that's 20-sided dice, to determine if something happens or if everything is successful when you try to play any of these cards. So if the risk is 11, like on the afforestation card, then basically you're adding that plus the thing I showed you before, stakeholder confidence, which is the bottom, sort of the middle there is sort of neutral. And if your stakeholder confidence is high, then you have a negative to that roll. Basically, we're trying to quantify the relationship of what happens when something could go wrong. Basically, trying to implement this. It could take longer, it could cost more, and the understanding is that it's common that it could. So we wanted to build in a system that accounted for that.
Yeah, so a lot of these things are meant to kind of, they don't exactly follow real life, but they kind of rhyme with it. So stakeholder confidence represents kind of the company's relationship with the regulator and the company's relationship with its other stakeholders, maybe its investors and so on. And then their risk goes up and down depending on kind of their past actions, have they behaved. So it's kind of, I thought it was a neat mechanism.
It fits into the characteristics of the facilities really well, I think, because if you're the power company and you decide to lower production, then people have blackouts and, well, I guess the term is brownouts, right, when they rule them or whatever. And that would be a big hit to stakeholder confidence. So with this mechanism, we can at least build that in, that you can't make sort of unrealistic choices just to game it and reduce your carbon as quickly as possible. The regulator rule. So there's the two phases I mentioned before. I know I'm describing how this game is played, but it's not much more. The action phase is when the emitters play their cards. The regulators then have a turn to try to discover what's happened. The sort of main mechanism behind this that we're trying to represent is that regulators are in many ways outnumbered by regulated facilities. And there's possibilities, one of which Jason mentioned, where you can move carbon to a different sort of area and then it suddenly doesn't count. So you're lowering your carbon emissions in a somewhat shady way. It's not quite in the spirit of the system to do so. So the regulators have mechanisms to investigate, follow up, and then eventually censure and stop actions that the others have taken in a previous turn. In some ways, it's unrealistic because not many facilities are going to risk that necessarily, but I think for the game to demonstrate what those possibilities are, it was worth the concession in terms of the simulation.
Yeah, we've talked about this quite a bit. That would be a pretty bad corporate strategy. That's going to upset a lot of people, but it makes the game a lot more fun. So
we're hoping students would immediately recognize this strategy as sort of a quick way to do something, and then the consequences would be clear at the end what had happened. Okay. Let's go through some of the tools as part of the process of creating the game, which I think is important in part because they're from the outset designed to be somewhat sustainable, that everyone can use them and sort of have not much of a slope in terms of learning to figure out how these work if they wanted to adapt things in their own classes. So if I gave these tools to Jason at a different university who does the same sort of job and has a class who'd be interested in playing this, how can they use it to play and modify things to do what they'd like? So one of the tools I used is a thing called Nendec. Basically, this is just like a way to visually prototype cards very quickly. It's on Windows. Might be better if I flip to it. Is that bigger? Yeah. Okay. So you can see this is from my initial sort of like this visual design is all me. So I'll take all the credit for that. The much lovelier visual design is Christina Oakman's. She's the artist for the game. But this is me sort of being able to prototype quickly and move through various cards. Just basically by changing one small part of these, you can change all of them. So when you're templating the cards, it makes it quite easy. All the cards have risk, so making this box here means that all the cards that I make has the box, the risk box at the bottom. Changing sort of the visual elements, that was easy to do. Where some difficulty sort of arose was in trying to translate this into Adobe, like Photoshop and a few other things, just because of transparency layers and some other stuff I don't understand very well. It didn't work as well as I'd hoped. But for a prototyping tool, especially to get sort of the philosophy behind it is get people playing with the pieces as quickly as possible. I think it works really well, especially if you're designing a card game. I do design a lot of card games, it seems. So yeah, that's Nandeck. Excel, and I can go over to, this is again a look behind the curtain in terms of what the actual levers are in the game. So all the things in Nandeck that you saw, the visual elements, are filled in by a CSV file, which is this. So they all have their various categories. And again, it's a quick way for me to modify something. So instead of like basically redoing each card each time, I can type in a new description when Jason and I have a discussion or we consult with other experts and they say, well, that doesn't really quite make sense for that card. Instead, you'd want to say something like this. I can change it, you know, the next time we speak, it's done, basically, which I thought was really cool. It's also something that everyone has access to. It doesn't have to be Excel, it can be not slides, whatever the Google version is, Calc, all the others. Yeah. I can go through some of these briefly. We're almost halfway done already. Time is a weird loop. So you have risk, cost, and action points, and this is by, I'm looking now at initial turn and secondary turn. When there's a colon in between, it just means like it costs something up front, and it costs less because you've already invested in the infrastructure. So a few things like that are built in. Yeah, I can't go too deep into this. We don't have time. But if anyone's interested in how the back end of this works, you can always ask me after. And this is going to be free to use for anyone who wants to play around with the levers and stuff. Okay. I did it. All right. Testing. I'll just let that sit for a minute because I think it's great.
But mine's to read out.
Oh no. Do you have a Calvin voice in your back pocket?
Oh, I don't know. I'm thinking of it. Oh, no, it's young, isn't it?
Yeah.
High pitched. I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 700 billion. Try to guess it.
11?
Nope. Guess again.
6,000,004.
Nope. Guess again. What's the matter with you? Don't you like games?
The testing didn't go this way. I just think it's a great representation of the possible relationship there. Testing is a huge part of the methodology that I use when I'm designing games, which is called values at play methodology. It's very iterative in that you're sort of doing some design and you're making sure that the things you wanted, the educational outcomes and the messages you wanted to communicate in the game are sort of brought to the surface. So every time there's a new batch of cards or prototype, we can go through it again. And the testing, it was super valuable to have people testing. We had Jason's co-op students come in and test. We had GI staff and co-op people test. The project team was always there testing. We have a big acknowledgement slide at the end too. But basically the idea was to get as close as possible to the target audience. And we'll talk about the sort of challenges of doing this in COVID, trying to get everyone going. But we ended up playing over 10 weeks? No, not that much, like 8 weeks. We played a longer game and then a few sort of short sessions where we tried to play the game all in one sitting just to see how people sort of grasp the rules right away. Anyone who was new would be brought up to speed. The process that process, the GI is sort of essential because they basically have people here who are interested in games and would want to sign up to do something like that.
Yeah, because it's pretty slow. Like the initial, the things don't quite work. There's some big tweaks and then some little tweaks to get the numbers right and things like that. So it's an important it was an important aspect of it. And I wouldn't have had a clue how to do this. So.
To start off, yeah, it's a challenge. Planning events ahead of time. We're almost jumping ahead to a couple slides from now, but one of the things that was sort of a major piece of feedback is like it was far too much math for somebody who was new to the game to do and like be comfortable doing in like an hour session. So we had to think, okay, what's the minimum number of people that could be on a team and do this? And that sort of changed the constraints of the game in a pretty big way. So things like that can come up, and it's important to test at every stage if you can. Yeah, scrap that. Okay, so this is talking about sort of what the final output was. So we have this sort of set of PDFs and instructions that have gone up to eCampus Ontario's website. This is the initial funding body, that provided money for the grants and sort of guidelines for how to sort of make sure that it's shared with everyone. So it's free curriculum for anyone to use. We can put up the link. I don't think I have it in the slides, unfortunately. At a different time, I'll add a slide with a bunch of links. But
And I think we should say, actually, this is a sort of electronic learning set of grants. So although we're talking about cards and so on, you can play this face to face. Actually, you could print them out. Really, the intention is that you play this on a computer screen over something like Teams, and you can do it either synchronously or asynchronously. And that's where the kind of chess by mail analogy came in. Is we were having to think of how do we, assuming this is distributed and we can't get everyone together at the same time, how are we going to make this game work? So we've got and we developed instructions, for an instructor planning to implement it as to how they'd actually go about setting that up. So the idea is there's a turn and it has some deadline, and people can figure out what to do whenever they want. And then at the end of the turn, there's a little roll for the regulators, and then the next turn begins. So
yeah. Goes back and forth like that. We also put guidelines in the instructions basically for how we would play a version in a class, sort of a contained version, call it like a campaign. But I mean, all of those levers and all the sort of math you can change. So if you wanted to give more action points to each of the sides, you could do that as a sort of beginner version to give them more freedom to try things they might want to do. You can change any of the stats in the Excel and print new cards pretty easily as well. So we thought of this as a sort of a way to set out as sustainable from the start, so that it's not something. I said postmortem in quotation marks for a reason, because I don't think anything like this, I never feel like it's done, but I don't think it ever is done if people are playing and giving you feedback, and you always have the tools that are ready to help change it and adapt to what people need. Yeah. Anyone can access it. We got that. Yeah. Oh, one thing. All right, we'll get to this. Oh yeah, so another thing that happens with this sort of thing, because it's going up on a website, there's compliance things that have to happen in terms of the colors on the cards and the artwork. We worked with the artist Christina Oakman, again a GI contact, who was available to do it and was great, and she got everything done to compliance standards. The Center for Extended Learning is another support mechanism on campus that deals with these VLS grants and how they work. Yeah, we want to provide a little bit of the inside baseball, just in case people are looking to apply for these or they think it sounds interesting. Anyway, you can ask us more after. Jason, you've done 2 of these?
Yeah.
Okay.
Both with CL, and they have lots of expertise about how to create things in the right format and choosing colors and contrast and so on. Which well, don't ask me details because I don't remember them, but I can tell you someone who does.
The name of the thing, in terms of their categories, I think was a new simulation or XR game. That was like the category we applied to. But there's a lot of others too. You could adapt existing content that's face-to-face to online as one of the things you can do for VLS. It's a pretty wide sort of range of things that are possible with it. So if anyone's looking to do a project and they don't know exactly where, it might be a good spot. All right, well, that's the end of the presentation, actually.
Yeah, we had more.
Sure.
There we go.
Why didn't it work? Okay. So this is us sort of talking and chatting, maybe a little more conversational than even it's been, about what the future consideration, benefits, and challenges are of doing something like this. Year-long grants, timelines are always a thing.
The timeline was really tight. There wasn't much time between getting the grant and having to deliver the product, and doesn't really line up with the academic cycle. Our initial plan was that we would play test this with my students that I was teaching, but that actually required that we play tested it in much smaller groups beforehand, because we couldn't have released like the alpha version on a class. It would have been very challenging. And we just weren't able to do that. Like the times we didn't, the class ended before we had the game ready. It was unfortunate, and it was sort of frustrating for us because we didn't get that feedback. So I'm teaching it again this fall, so we'll use it and we'll get some experience then. But unfortunately, by then the grant has ended, so we've lost some of the resources. But
devoting time, all of a sudden people are doing things. If you're a grad student and you're working for free, that may not be the best for you. You may not have that opportunity. I can come back and do stuff. I'm lucky in that I want to do this, and I'm motivated to, but that's not always the case. So yeah, that grant cycle is always an interesting thing to navigate in terms of improving the game later on, for sure. One way to do it though is to get feedback and maybe revisit it every year, sort of cycle like that. That's what I was thinking with this bullet point. So if you could survey the people that have used it, I'm not even sure that mechanism is possible, but if you just know who's downloaded it, and you could have a list of those, maybe like email them or something.
Yeah, I don't know if we can find that out or not.
Yeah, it's tough, because that would be cool, because then you get that feedback and then you can improve it for everyone. guaranteed somebody running it in the class will have something to say.
Yeah.
Complex enough. Oh yeah, one thing we wanted to get to but didn't have time for again was like, how do we, so every sort of turn you take and all the ways that the math works are done by hand by the teams and submitted to the instructor, sort of updates the board. So there's a lot of like honor system and general just sort of like reporting, your self-reporting there, as opposed to automating it through an app or some other sort of online mechanism. We didn't, even Excel if possible, we didn't quite get there, but I think that'd be a good next step. It just makes it a lot more user-friendly, I think, to anyone starting. Yeah,
Yeah, I think we'll get that done sometime in the next few months.
Yeah, just more of it being an analog game, because I love the idea of having a game that's in a box that's cool, you can bring places. Definitely a party game that everybody would love to play, I'm sure. But at least having it in a box would be cool. Again, I don't know if Christina would be available, but again, the grant funding mechanism and cycle sort of limits us there. It's like we'd have to apply again and see if we get more money, like we're adapting the thing we already did. Hey, we're great, please, please, please. But we'll see. I think that would be awesome. Yeah, and then just us having classes that are willing to play, whether that's even Neil's game studies class. Yeah. He's nodding, it's good.
Yeah.
People at the GI, just like more people playing the game is always the key, because they're going to find things you didn't consider or play it in ways that you never expected, and just more and more testing, I think it's super valuable. Our own website for feedback was an option as well. If we can't get VLS data, if there's not a thing that's allowed, then having a way for people to respond and just be like, hey, what did you think and how do we change? Yeah, improving aspects of the hybrid design that goes under the sort of same rubric as the automating the math thing. But basically having maybe our own app that did that, I think would be cool. That's like a lot of design money and implementation coding money to make that happen, I think.
Yeah, no, like our original vision had a lot of this running very slickly in kind of an app, and then it became apparent that that was a much bigger project.
Building apps, not cheap.
The resources that we had available to us, so like both time and money.
Definitely a future thought. So what about challenges? Did I say a lot of words that were Englishy sometimes and you didn't understand? You're like, well, I don't know what he's saying.
My English is okay.
No, I mean literary criticism.
No, I think I thought that worked quite well. Where because I'm like on the technical side, and I thought we figured it out. We went back and forth a bit with descriptions and so on, but I thought that was okay. It was a challenge doing it during COVID because I don't remember the first time we actually met in person. It was way at the end of the.
It was at least 8 months in or something.
Yeah, and I think it would have been early on. I think it would have been really nice to sit around a table with a whiteboard and scribble rather than attempting to do that over Teams. And I guess that was kind of the problem we were solving as well, was to make an electronic thing. That was part of this VLS motivation for that. Yeah, that round of grants was, I think, due to COVID, although they started before that and they're keeping on going. So it was just a catalyst for an extra round, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges for me was definitely testing, but we've already said some of the reasons that wasn't really possible. I think if I were to do it again, that's always the re-roll. What if I could do it again? Then I think from the outset, I would have had a class of 12 signed up. Like, doesn't matter what we have. This date it's happening, just to see the bigger group playing it, because we never quite got there. It was always a smaller representation, but that's it is what it is. Right. Benefits. I mean, I got to make a game for a year. That was cool. I really liked it as a starting place for people that are enthusiastic about games.
I feel the same way though. Like I'd never made a game before. I didn't know anything about game design, so it was cool for me. And that was a GI thing, really. That was how we. I'd never proposed it on my own. Like sort of, I'd heard of the idea of like serious games, and I thought it was cool, but I wouldn't have known where to begin. So I think that worked out really well.
It's good. We sort of softballed these challenges. Maybe people have more for us in the question period. We talked a bit about the grant already. I think that's probably good. We want to acknowledge before we do questions, because I think there's like 15 minutes left. Yeah. Just the team, because it wasn't just us who made this. Obviously, maybe it's not obvious to some people, but it takes a lot of people to create something like this. A lot of feedback from people and a lot of their time donated. Christina is our artist. Pam was at every meeting and she did testing, which was amazing. And she did structural stuff to make sure that we were all on track. It was amazing. Neil was there giving his input and playing when he could. Yeah. I'm not going to call everyone out by name. That's weird, I think. It's going to take a long time. I appreciate all the consulting and testing people that were there for the odd time just to help us play and figure out how it works. It was awesome. Never underestimate how valuable that can be, just having a new set of eyes at your sort of table to play your game.
Oh yeah, they really made a big difference. They'd say, "Oh, this isn't obvious," and it was, you've been looking at it and talking about it for 6 months, everything's obvious. And a new person coming in that doesn't have that perspective and tells you what you need to explain and clarify.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, thank you for listening. We appreciate it. Yeah. Now we'll do questions. Is there a particular format for? Gonna go back to the fortune cookie.
That's perfect. Thanks so much, guys. That was great. So we're going to do online audience questions first. That's good with you guys. And
Yep.
then we'll move on to in-person questions. So first is, how did the game change over the course of play testing? Did you update any large parts of the design to make the game more fun? And that question's from Rory.
Nice, to make it more fun.
We simplified the math a bit to make it less tedious.
Is that more fun though? That's a different. Less tedious is true. Yeah. It was.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's meant to be engaging. It's a
Yeah.
it's a pedagogical game, so it's the idea is to make it engaging, but it's not. This isn't like a game you're going to go play on Friday night with your friends because you want to conquer the planet or something. Yeah.
Very huge there.
Yeah. I was gonna call out a person by name who
Yeah.
would love playing
Yeah.
this. But, yeah. I think there's a limited subsection of people who would find this fun to just do on a Friday evening, but those people are out there for sure.
Yeah.
And yeah, diminishing or not diminishing, but making some of the math simpler. I had like a weird sort of system for the modifiers for risk for a while. And I think Neil just looked at it and he's like, there's too many numbers and one of them doesn't even need to be there. I was like, oh, okay. And that was one way to sort of make it simpler. Yeah, I think, does it correlate directly with fun? I don't know.
Like I remember we had a good look at the cards that we'd produced, like the different actions and so on, because there's a whole pile of things companies could do. You can make like a 300 card deck, but we don't want that. So I think we did look at that for, I don't know about fun, but more for interest, to have a good variety and a flavor of different things.
There's way more drama in the game than at the beginning. So just to do it sort of like the most realistic way possible, you wouldn't have any of this shady stuff. And I want to like look at that and try to censor you. That part I think is more fun now.
Yeah, we brought that up a little bit because it's not really such a big deal in real life.
Yeah,
like,
corporations don't like
it's a bad idea. They don't like upsetting their regulator because it comes back on them in other ways. So
it makes a lot of sense that they would be watched more carefully after that too. Like, what are you doing? Yeah. I hope that answered the
No, I
question.
think that works. So the second question would be, they said that you kind of already answered this, but I think you could expand on it. Are players working with their groups remotely? How do they communicate with another as they make decisions? So I think more, because you already answered that, what do you see as like the ideal scenario for how it would unfold?
Okay.
Remotely, in person.
So we have different answers, I think, because you started in the middle of the presentation, you thought that we had started with digital in mind as the model, but I was thinking analog in my head, I think, like playing in a room with people sitting at tables. It's sort of like, yes, there's screens involved, but passing along notes even, like that sort of like big room game design versus what I think it's probably better optimized for, which is actually just playing on Teams or Discord, whatever you like. Yeah. So you have DMs with the people that are on your team and you correlate and not correlate, you make moves together, plan.
I mean, in terms of how the teams function, though, it's a really interesting question. This is about like team building and team theory, and I mean, they could do it in different ways. They could do the whole thing asynchronously and just kind of, text each other, or they could meet synchronously and sort of hammer things out. And there's probably there's going to be pros and cons each way. I mean, there's probably a whole learning about teamwork thing there that you could tack on, which would be a bit excessive for this, but. I don't think there's a right answer. I think it's up to the group to figure out what they prefer.
Awesome. Okay, so I guess next online question is from Bree. She says, thanks so much for sharing about this project. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more about the research creation component. What is something key that you found during the creation process, either in the design or aesthetic portions, that really impacted where you took the final product?
Okay, that's a good question. Thank you.
I'm going to look at you for that.
Research creation project, yeah. Trying to think of the beginning. It's hard to remember the beginning when we're just planning things and how that's changed so much, because I've been looking at the same version of it for so long. I would say that over the period of the sort of grant and project, I found myself more often looking at sort of design and methodology theory and trying to incorporate sort of aspects of, like when I'm phrasing something, I found a way to sort of incorporate more of what I had set out to do in terms of the values into the writing of like each description. That's a thing that happened. Whereas before I was kind of like just, okay, at the beginning it was sort of just put information in, we need to like play with it. And by the end we were to the point where we were refining, and I felt like there was more of like the original educational outcomes reflected in each piece, and that I could like pinpoint that and sort of like get good at writing that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I'd add, for me as sort of the non-expert, what was interesting is when we first started talking together and writing the proposal was that there's method, there's theory about how you design it, and there's a process by which you create it, and that was like that was all new to me, and that was an interesting aspect for me. It doesn't quite answer the question, but it's related. Yeah.
You don't know how much more theoretical I can go. That's a question. Thank you. And thank you, Rory. Should have said that first.
I do have, that was great. I do have one more online question, then I'm sorry, I think then we'll let people in person ask questions. So you mentioned that this game doesn't quite reflect the complexities of real life, but it rhymes with reality. Do you think this game would be helpful for people in government who need to better understand cap and trade? And that was from Murray.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good question. I did wonder about that a number of times, even at the beginning and as we were developing it and with the final product. I think it would be interesting for both government and industry to kind of play around and understand maybe what some of the challenges are. And I worked for a consulting company for some years, and one of the challenges sometimes is regulators don't always appreciate what the company's perspective is on things. They don't, and they tend to be very cooperative. They're trying to regulate, but they're not trying to like shut anyone down or anything. They want their regulations to be workable. But I think it would be interesting for them to kind of experience both sides of that coin. From the corporate perspective, kind of the same thing. There's probably not a ton of strategy lessons in there. They're going to figure the strategy out in their own way. There's like regular business decisions for them. But it's still maybe sort of an interesting thing to play with.
Sort of like walk in each other's shoes sort of thing. Yeah.
At one point, we didn't mention this, one of the sort of design suggestions that we had for when people are playing is you could have people switch, which is just the walk in the other person's shoes thing. So if you haven't been a regulator yet, then you can be one during the course. If people played for a whole, I imagine, term or semester, then it would be like you'd have the chance to be one or two of the emitters for a couple of weeks, and then you play the regulators so everyone can get a feel for how that goes. And that would be one way to communicate those lessons, that they're not opposing, but the system sort of makes it that way sometimes, that kind of thing.
And that's something that we'd like to do more testing on, because it's obviously the more times there'll be a saturation point where everyone's had enough, and I don't know how many I don't know how many games that is.
How many hours of choosing how to run it?
Yeah.
Okay, one more online question. I lied. We have another one. You mentioned that one particular person who play tested the game found it fun. Based on your playtesting experience, would you say that a player who finds the game fun is more open to critically engaging with the material? I guess because they're more inherently interested.
I mean, they're going to notice things, and so almost by default, I think they would be more. Well, if they're talking about how they feel after, I should say, then they'd feel, yeah, then they would be telling us stuff that maybe we hadn't noticed because they're deep into the systems, I guess. That makes sense. The one person who was a hypothetical, they didn't actually get to play it yet, but I will put it in front of them at some point.
That'll be interesting.
I don't want to say their name out loud, but I do. Be like, you would love this, but you wouldn't. Yeah. Yeah.
It would be interesting to see what feedback you got based on people's kind of wider interest and experience playing games, actually, because I know one of my co-op students have played quite a bit of games, and he his comments were different in nature to the other ones, you know, based on, and I presume it was, you know, based on his experience doing similar things.
Yeah. We didn't have someone, because I'm not such a huge player of management sims, which would be one of the genres this actually shares a lot with, or even the 4X strategy thing, which is Civ. So if we had we didn't have someone on the team who was like really into that area, that would have been a cool perspective maybe to have.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so does anyone in the IRL audience have a question they want to ask? Neil? Anyone want to go before Neil? Okay, yep.
So I might have missed this, but so when you're setting up the emitters and regulators, are there like profiles, right? Or is there like characters that you're giving them, saying you're kind of embodying it? It's like, where do they get those motivations from?
Yeah, one of the slides I had what I call a rule card up, and that's basically the thing you would hand to them with a little bit of a preamble sort of about the game in the instruction manual. So those are the two things you would give to a regulated emitter team, and they can have it. And it gives you sort of the loose constraints of like budget to start and emissions to start and that sort of thing. More detailed, we've toyed with like the idea of having the regulators have even more information, because the whole idea is that they'd have data about like the same data we had in designing the game, basically, right? So they'd have all the industrial sort of breakdowns of, you know, who emitted what, which industry. So maybe they would have a bigger data package, but we didn't get to like solidifying that. It's more up to the instructor at this point. So it's both.
Yeah.
It's a loose role that does constrain them, but not as much as you might think, I guess.
So like for educational games, it's tough to hit all of the boxes possible. That's they're complex topics by design. So like between encouraging interest in a general audience, developing vocabulary for like academic discussion, and being, like someone said, a simulation tool for people in the industry. Kind of a two-part question. Did you already have a good idea of where the game would be positioned from the start? And then like, was there kind of a shift as you developed, and kind of where the biggest shift would be?
Okay, that's interesting.
I think we had even the initial proposal had those kind of intended learning outcomes for the students, which I think really kind of speaks to what our intentions were in making it, which was really, I guess it's kind of around the vocabulary and understanding, and then the strategy piece. And I don't think it changed a huge amount during development. We maybe deprioritized a bit the understanding of the different jurisdictions in Canada. That would be something that would have to go. It would inform that, but that would have to go elsewhere in the class. It would be kind of, you know, remember that you played this game, or imagine if you set it up like this, that would kind of look like Alberta, or if you set it up like this, it would look like BC or whatever. But I think it was fairly consistent.
Consistently aimed at, yeah, the undergrad student classes. I don't know, like the policy tool and the general sort of literacy tool, to have it as a front-facing thing wasn't necessarily on the table, though I think it can be used for that. I think maybe the science descriptions are a little above the average if you were to try to give it to the public. I'm not sure. That's kind of up to you, because the students in a second year science class will have some basis, a little bit at least.
Yeah, I think they're fairly accessible to someone with some, you need some science background, but I don't know, I was thinking high school, but
Is grade 10
maybe,
science enough? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the question.
I guess that would be a good, we need some different playtesters again.
Then that's a writing challenge to get adapt it if you were to play it. I think it'd be cool to try and play it with 4 different audiences in a month. Just like, no, it's too soon, 3 months. And then each month change it and sort of tweak it to try to meet that audience's needs better.
And that, I mean, that was a writing challenge actually in the in developing the text on those cards, because I'm like I use this in a 4th year chemical engineering class, so I don't want there to be like technical errors on the card, but we also want it to be accessible to at least people in kind of broader kind of university classes that aren't in chem eng. So in that case, we need to, so it has to be simple enough for them to understand. We've got to take some of the detail out, and that's a balance, which was, we went back and forth quite a bit on some of the card descriptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the one rule that we had is like, if I don't understand it, having talked to Jason about it for months, then probably it's not great. That's, yeah. Although, yeah, maybe not the best barometer.
Neil, are you ready for your question?
I think that it's been asked. Well, I'll answer your question a few times. You have to play this. The answer is you can actually stand the thought, teaching one more thing. It's not done. If you pass the point where you just can't stand it. I want to hit again on questions been kind of asked in a variety of ways. Jason, do you feel this is successful even at this stage as a tool in classroom? I realize that this is done. This point is pedagogical, as it either succeeded or begun.
Yeah, so I haven't actually used it in a class yet, so I guess that will be the proof of the pudding. Yeah, I think it is though. Like I've taught this class a couple of times on this material, and it's something that's tricky for students to get their head around. It is not intuitive, and it's like a carbon trading system is like a bunch of rules, and then to present that in kind of a dry lecture type format. Whether they read it or whatever is not great, and I think this will be a lot more engaging and interesting, and that they'll get a bit more of an idea of how the emitters might think, because especially my students, they may end up in these kind of roles, companies dealing with this type of problem, and hopefully they'll go into that with a little bit more perspective than they would have done otherwise. So I think yes, and I'm hopeful it's going to be fun, and it'll be a fun week in the fall to play this.
Next question. You're under constraint because we do the game, making sure the thinking is out. You need to be able to teach it. You need to be able to have people get together and exchange information. It's simply now detailed. Start getting. If you can remove those digital game and simulation, and you can start building. You might have to give you an interface rather than. What happens to this game? Well, how does it change? Take it, and you get to the point where a visual version. I don't think the moment. If you remove the constraints that the analog has, potentially those constraints, forget about TV, but just what you see in order to teaching.
That's a good question. I mean, there's a whole bunch of nuances that we kind of dropped out of the simulation, and I guess if it's digital, we can start building them back in. So, for example, even the roll cards, like we've got 4 different roll cards, In reality, there's not a cement industry. There's a whole bunch of different players that do that, and all of them have different problems. They have different facilities in different places, and some of those facilities are new and efficient, this is one of the allocation problems, actually. So if you build something new, it's as efficient as it can be. That's how people tend to make new stuff, and that means that your scope for reducing your emissions is normally quite small because you kind of build it in. Whereas if you have a really old facility that someone built 50 years ago and it's been kind of morphed and modified since then, you might have a whole pile of cheap projects that you can do to bring it more towards the modern standard. So I think you could bring a whole load of those things in. I mean, another thing that companies do is the regulation is at the facility level, but most facilities are part of a bigger company. So one of the questions that those companies have is how do you manage your compliance across your different facilities? Because there may be an optimal way for them to do things. Like those performance credits, you could trade them just internally. You could move them from, the best thing to do as a company might be to move the credits from one facility to a different facility in the same jurisdiction. So I think you could start to build all those things in, which would be really cool, but it could get very big. So that would be the challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Expansion. Cards I can use to do this.
I mean, there's really no ceiling if we just add more people to the teams. That's totally how it could work.
Yeah.
They can all work together perfectly. It'll be fine.
I guess if it's digital, though, you can have a computer team as well. Like you can have yeah.
All right, so I think that's time for today. So everyone, if you could join me in thanking Alex and Jason one more time.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to thank the digital audience too for your patience with any technical difficulties. We're still figuring out this hybrid thing, and thanks you guys for putting up with our slide projector difficulties. Thanks everyone.